roundtable session of the day, we would like to introduce the moderator, Honorable Senator Datuk Theodore Douglas Lind, and the panel, Ms. Clarissa Surtees, Deputy Clerk of the House of Representatives, Parliament of Australia, to deliver her presentation entitled The Australian Committee System and the Differences Between the Two Houses. For that, we hand the session over to the moderator, Honorable Senator Theodore and Ms. Clarissa Surtees. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Honorable Speakers and Deputy Speaker of the State Assembly, Honorable Members of the Senate, we're proud today to have with us Ms. Clarissa Surtees who is the Deputy Clerk of the House of Representatives from Australia. And she will be presenting her paper. It's called The Australian Committee System and the Differences Between the Two Houses. I think this is very relevant because they are also a federal system like we are in Malaysia. So if we may start immediately so not to waste any time. Ms. Surtees, you can please.
Thank you very much, Honourable Senator. So, Honourable Speakers and Honourable Senators and all invited guests, thank you very much for this kind invitation to come along today and speak with you about parliamentary committees. I've also been privileged to be able to attend the opening of the second session of your Parliament yesterday. So when you work at the Parliament, it's always very good to go along to other parliaments and see how they do their own ceremonies. So thank you very much. That's very, very kind. So today we're looking at parliamentary committees, and I've done a little handout here for you. I'm not going to necessarily mention everything that's on the handout, but I wanted you to have something to go away with and perhaps read later on and reflect on your discussions here today, because I understand you've had a very productive session already this morning, and there will be some issues that will be in common between this session and the last. So the fundamental issue about parliamentary committees is, why have we got them? And when you're talking about committees that are established to conduct formal investigations, they're usually focusing on one of these matters. So proposed legislation, matters of policy that are yet to be determined, or they're looking at the performance of the government in terms of its administration or delivery of programs. So they're the sort of issues that are usually the focus of parliamentary committee inquiries. Now, in the Australian Parliament, we have committees both for the House of Representatives and the Senate, and I'll just give you a brief overview of some of those factors. So the committees themselves reflect the membership of the individual houses. So as we've got here on this particular slide, there are 76 senators, and they're representing the interests of their states in a way similar, as I understand, to your own senators representing the interests of their states. And they're engaged in a program of scrutiny of government, and the senators themselves refer to the Senate as a house of review. So they're the sort of key issues, I think, worth bearing in mind as we look at the committees. Of course, the House of Representatives is quite different. It's the House of Government. The Prime Minister and most of the Cabinet sit in the House of Representatives. So quite a different focus. They're elected directly by their constituents. But nevertheless, there are certain factors in there that help the members to also ensure that the government is accountable through question time, through debates on legislation, and through debates on other matters. But the making of laws is the dominant purpose of the House in terms of the time that is spent in debate. So as I indicated, we have committees from the House of Representatives, we have committees drawn from senators. We also have a large number of committees on which both members and senators work together. For committees such as the Public Accounts Committee, Public Works Committee, Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade. So these sort of areas at our Parliament, there's been a decision that it should be members and senators working together when they're considering matters in that subject area. Now, particularly in terms of Senate committees, their members are appointed by the Senate, and the chairs of the committees in the Senate, some of them are government chairs and some of them are non-government chairs. There are special features of Senate committees, which I'll go into in more detail, and there's a clear distinction between the committee work in the Senate and that conducted in the House of Representatives. The noticeable feature is that there are many more bill inquiries conducted by Senate committees than there are in House committees. And in terms of scrutiny of government expenditure, the budget estimates processes occur twice each year, conducted by Senate committees, and there is not such a similar process conducted by the House committees. Oh, there we go. Instead, House committees tend to focus on more policy-based inquiries, and their work together, the work of the members on House committees, I can say from observing and from what the members themselves say about their work, it's very much a non-partisan environment on the committees. So they're not constantly in opposition to one another. It's very much a collaborative exercise. Now, as we mentioned before, the House can refer various matters to the committees, whether it's legislation, policy or public administration. They tend to be the focus. And sometimes these inquiries take the members and senators away from Canberra. And so, for example, I've got a photograph here which you'll see in your material. This is an example of a committee travelling to the very northernmost parts of Australia, between the top of the mainland and Papua New Guinea in the Torres Strait there. This is on one of the small islands. We have the committee sitting there meeting with members of the community, and in the background you'll notice there's a cameraman there, and at the table we have the reporting staff from the Parliament, so keeping the Hansard record of the discussions that are taking place. So on this occasion, for this particular inquiry, the committee felt that it should go to these small, remote communities, thousands of kilometres away from the capital in Canberra, because these people would probably never go to visit Canberra. So if you want their views about the inquiry, then you need to go to them and to listen to what they have to say. The membership of committees varies enormously. So from the smallest committee of 6 members to the largest committee of 32. And in fact, it's one of the joint committees, the Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade Committee, that has 32 members, and they are a composition of members and senators. The power and authority for the committees comes from the rules that apply to the Parliament, so the standing orders that apply in each of the houses, separate resolutions of each house, and sometimes the authority for committees is in legislation. It just depends on the nature of the committee. So, for example, the Public Accounts Committee, that's a statutory committee, and so a lot of its rules are found in legislation. But of course, there's often need to have reference to the other rules about parliamentary committees. And so for the joint committees at our Parliament, if there's a need to refer to the standing orders, then you can imagine there might be some confusion here because we have standing orders for the House of Representatives, standing orders for the Senate. Which ones do we rely on? Well, if there's ever a point of conflict, then it is the Senate standing orders that are the principal source of reference for joint committees. And so that gives them a level of certainty in terms of their operation. The committees have an area of focus, so defined by subject matter for the committees that are established under standing orders, the types of committees that you refer to as select committees. Then they would cover the portfolio areas, similar to a minister's responsibilities. And in terms of some of the powers available to committees, their work is protected by parliamentary privilege, which at our parliament is consolidated into an Act of Parliament, and the free speech protection is regarded as a very powerful tool for committees so that they can engage in an open discussion with both the more formal sorts of witnesses that come from the government agencies administering the various policies and programs, but also any witnesses from communities. So any citizens that are taking part in the inquiries of the committee, they are also able to be protected and encouraged to be open and forthcoming to the committee so that the committee can gather the evidence it needs in order to complete its inquiry. Now we have a number of committees which assist with the administration of the Parliament, and we have committees in the Senate, so the Regulations and Ordinances Committee and the Scrutiny of Bills Committee and the Selection of Bills Committee. Those three committees give the Senate quite a distinct flavour, and so we should just have a little bit of a look at those. Oops. So in terms of the Legislation and References Committees, they cover the portfolio areas, and these committees are often referred to as the pairs of committees, and I'll explain what is meant by that. Operating in one stream with a government chair, the committees will look at the bills that relate to those portfolio areas, and they will also consider the budget estimates. So that's a very specific and powerful role that those legislation committees have. And in terms of the references committees with the non-government chair, then they will have opportunities to investigate and report on policy and other matters that are referred to the committees by the Senate. So two quite separate streams of work. It's basically the same grouping of members, but they're operating in two separate areas of responsibility. The Senate has a committee called the Selection of Bills Committee, and this committee considers all proposed legislation before the Parliament and determines whether there are issues there that might need further investigation, and if the Selection of Bills Committee decides that there are issues that warrant specific investigation, then the bill will be referred to one of those references committees that we already have been introduced to, the legislation committees, sorry, under those separate portfolio areas, and the bill inquiry can take place. So each year there'd be a couple of hundred bill inquiries conducted by Senate committees. In relation to budget estimates, so you'd all be familiar with the appropriations that are passed in Parliament, so at the Australian Parliament. Twice each year, the legislation committees conduct budget estimates. Now, they're very powerful processes where the senior staff of government departments and agencies attend before committees of the Senate. Here's a photograph of one. And the ministers will accompany the staff too, and the senators on the Estimates Committee will ask questions of the senior staff of the government departments and of the minister, not about the policy issues, but about how the money has been expended. So very important scrutiny of investigating the nature of expenditure and the effectiveness of that expenditure, and this is all conducted in a public hearing. This particular room is one of the committee rooms in Parliament House. The Regulations and Ordinances Committee, so this is the committee that looks at the delegated legislation. It's not sufficient just to have the bills or the acts that are passed. Often you need some greater detail of rules, and they're put into the delegated legislation. But because it's delegated and the Parliament hasn't had to actively consider what's in each provision of the statutory rules or legislative instruments, then this particular committee is supported by an independent legal advisor, reviews that delegated legislation with a set of principles to ensure that individual rights and liberties aren't adversely impacted by that secondary legislation. And if there are issues, they'll report on those issues to the Senate, and then it's a matter for the individual agencies to come along and to respond to any of the problems that might have been identified by the Senate committee. In relation to the Scrutiny of Bills Committee, it considers the bills before the Senate, again with a view to looking at any adverse consequences for individual citizens or the rule of law, and will put out a report to the Senate and indicate whether there are matters there that need to be investigated further. Now, in terms of the process that's engaged in for inquiries, they're very similar really, regardless of the nature of the specific terms of reference. But once there are an established terms of reference, then the committees will take the opportunity to promote those to the community, and they do this in order to encourage people who have an interest in the subject area to make a formal submission to the committee, and get written submissions perhaps, or get their interest and have them contact the committee. And in this way they can identify those witnesses they would like to hear from in a public hearing, or they can identify the particular premises that they would like to go and inspect, so that the members of the committee, so that the senators or the members can understand the specific issues that are being raised by the terms of reference. They do this in order to inform themselves and to ensure that they're hearing the competing arguments in relation to the policy or the program that's being reviewed, or indeed the legislation. So once the committee is satisfied that they've got sufficient evidence, they will consider that evidence and reach conclusions, determine their recommendations, and compose those in a formal report to the Senate, and then present that report to the Senate. After the there's a requirement that the government will make a response in relation to any committee report, and so after the period has passed, the government will respond to those recommendations. Now here's just a few photos to give you an idea of how the committees go about their work. This is a little bit old, and I'm sorry for that, but I couldn't get you a photo of the new arrangement, but this is actually a video conference that the committee's engaging in. So there were some witnesses who couldn't come to Canberra, and the committee couldn't go to where they were, so they arranged for the witnesses to go along to one of the suitable office accommodation and have a video conference so the committee could take evidence from those witnesses. So this is a bit simple, this arrangement, but the ones these days are a little bit more conducive to having that interchange with people who are a long way away from Canberra, long way away from where the committee is, but nevertheless having that very important opportunity to put their views to the committee. And this one obviously is about a mining site. So the committee went to visit this particular site. Often the mines in Australia are a very long way away, nowhere near towns or communities. And this particular inquiry is about the workers who are flying into the mine site and staying there for a couple of weeks before they then fly home again. So it was this, they call it fly-in, fly-out working arrangement, and the committee was conducting an inquiry into that. So the outcomes for committees, as you'd expect, making some important recommendations for the government so that the government might be introducing some improvements or some changes to their policy or legislation. Committee work can lead to exposing administrative or financial inadequacy or problems, which is very important in terms of maintaining the confidence of the community in the government and in the Parliament. The committee work informs parliamentary debate about important issues, which you'll all understand the significance of that, about the Parliament being, having a strong role to play in terms of understanding what's important to the society. And they present very important opportunities for members and senators to work together away from the chambers in a very bipartisan way and to develop very close working relationships. Members often say that it's the first time they've had a chance to even meet some of their fellow parliamentarians, and then when they're engaged in this very close consideration of terms of reference on an inquiry, they develop quite a good working relationship with their fellow members, some of whom are in a different party completely, and they find that they've got a lot in common with them in terms of their work experience and their contributions to the Parliament. This particular image is of a committee that had just presented their report to the House of Representatives, as it turns out, but Senate committees do this as well. And so they wanted to make sure that the media took up the opportunity to inform the public about the recommendations that were contained in the report. And so they called a press conference in one of the committee rooms in Parliament House, and the media obliged and came along with their cameras and their microphones and their journalists, took notes, asked questions, and the committee promoted the work that they had just spent many months completing. So it was a very welcome opportunity for the committee to talk about its work and to get some wider recognition for that work outside just the chamber itself. There are certainly many benefits to individual members in their committee work. Sometimes they'll be looking at policy issues they've never had to think about before. They might also be focusing on government processes which are quite new to them. So through their committee work, they can develop a greater understanding of the framework of the government itself. as well as, and senators often say this because senators don't have a small electorate of their own, they represent the whole state, they don't get that opportunity to have a strong connection in relation to community issues, but through the work of committees they get exposed to the nature of those issues, and so they find that's a very valuable opportunity for them. And likewise, the community can learn something about the processes of the parliament, have a greater understanding of the role of parliamentarians, and also get a little bit of satisfaction about understanding some of the programs and policies of the government that have been considered in the course of the inquiry. Just a couple of more photos of how the members like to get out and about, the committee members like to get out and about and get their hands literally dirty looking at various things, or they can just have meetings too in other places, or get out onto the docks as they did in this occasion. Now, the work for committees, of course, is supported by the Secretariat staff, and they provide services such as research and writing and supporting the administration of the committees. There's a secretary in charge of the small teams, and the staff involved in supporting the committees will often have experience in terms of being able to research a subject and to provide the writing support too for when the reports are prepared. And as well as that, of course, the Secretariat needs to coordinate any other support services for the committee, like the Hansard or broadcasting services, and also helps to prepare the outreach information that's provided to the media and to the public. Websites these days are a great way for committees to promote their work. All the committees at the Parliament of Australia have a separate website, and they're using social media a lot these days too to inform the community about the various activities. So when there's a public hearing, they will try to make sure that people are aware that the public hearing is taking place and encourage a greater participation and attendance in that way. So just to finish off with a bit of information about committees. The general purpose standing committees in the House again cover the portfolio areas, a little bit differently to those in the Senate. Houses do things differently, even when they're at the same Parliament. They have a different combination of subject areas sometimes, but they still manage to cover the field. Again, there's domestic committees at the House, which help with the administration of the House itself. And I mentioned some joint committees, so you'll see here these committees covering things like intelligence and security, public accounts and audit, public works. So joint statutory committees, these ones, with members and senators working together. And these joint standing committees established by resolution rather than the statute, and covering a whole range of issues, treaties, for example, electoral matters, so very important issues that have got very much a non-partisan interest in terms of needing to make sure things are dealt with successfully, and so they're dealt with these joint standing committees. At the moment, we have a few select committees. Now, I'm sorry this is going to sound confusing to you, but we call the committees that are established for a short period of time select committees, whereas the committees that exist for the life of the Parliament we call standing committees. Now, I think this is a bit opposite to the way the terminology works at your Parliament, but as long as we understand the difference, then it shouldn't matter too much. So each of these committees, when their work is completed, then those committees will cease to exist because they've been established for a very limited specific purpose. And so at the conclusion, there's a few references for you if you did want to look up and find out a little bit more detail about anything. The web address for the Parliament and the main procedural text, the ODGES Senate practice for the Senate, and House of Representatives practice for the House of Representatives. Of course, there are standing orders, separate standing orders for each House, and those items at the bottom, the Senate briefs and the House info sheets, they're short explanations of specific issues that you might find handy if you're looking for a general explanation about an issue. Then I'd suggest you might want to have a look at those. They're all available through the website. So apart from that, I think there's plenty of time to have some questions if members in the audience would have anything. Thank you for listening.
On behalf of all the honourable senators, I would like to thank Ms. Carissa Surtees for her presentation. I think it's been very extensive and broad, and I think we can, because we share the same political system, but being federal related. So I think well, we could share some experience, and I would like to open this up for question and answer, maybe exchange of views as well, how we can ways relevant. Can I open up to the floor, please? Anybody?
Excuse me.
Yes.
Yep. Thank you, Ms. Clarissa. My name is Muiz. I'm one of the academics attached to the Senate Reform Committee. Thank you for the presentation. It was really wonderful. First of all, my first question is, you have a lot of committees in the joint committees, Senate committee and House committee. And I'd just like to ask, what is the source of authority for such creation? All right, and especially for those temporary ones, because I understand that there are some statutory committee that is set up in the Parliament, but what about the temporary ones? What is the source of authority for such creation? Yeah, that's it. That's that. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question. Yes, there are a lot of committees set up at the Parliament, and at the commencement of each Parliament, so we're coming towards the end of our Parliament at the moment, at the commencement of each Parliament there is a bit of reflection and thought given to which committees will be established now. So of course with the statutory committees they're more certain, because there's been broad general agreement that these committees should exist and be re-established at the commencement of each Parliament. The ones that are established by standing order, so they're the ones that cover the portfolio areas, they're in the standing orders, they're reviewed at the commencement of each Parliament, because as you would understand, especially if there's a change of government, then the actual coupling of the portfolio responsibilities might change from one Parliament to another. So the committees usually reflect that change. In relation to the other committees, the ones that we call select committees, but the sort of temporary committees, they arise over the course of the Parliament. So if there's an issue identified that members or senators feel needs some further attention, then the terms of reference will be developed and that committee will be established, and typically for these temporary committees they would have a reporting date. So there'd be an expectation that the committee would conclude its work by the set date, and that then the committee would cease to exist once it had issued that report. It's always an issue though about having so many committees, and one of the concerns that the committees have, and this especially relates to consideration of bills, if the House committees and the Senate committees were to investigate the same bills, then you'd be basically bringing along the same witnesses. And so the committees are very much aware that this could be a bit of a burden for witnesses to have to prepare two sets of submissions or presentations to public hearings. And so that's always a consideration about you know, whether or not you in fact have two largely similar inquiries conducted into legislation in particular, because of it seems inefficient to have two parliamentary committees conducting inquiries into the same thing. So that's always a bit of a consideration, but that sort of consideration takes place at the political level. Yeah, thank you.
My name is Muhammad Asfian Nassar. I am the Speaker of the State Legislature of Sarawak. My question is, in the Australian perspective, in the Australian context and experience, in terms of performance, what are the marked differences and contrasts between a senator who is appointed and a senator who is elected?
Well, thank you, Speaker. That's a very interesting question. So for the Australian Parliament, all of our senators are elected. At each general election, the Constitution provides that half of the senators of the states will face an election with the whole of the 150 members of the House of Representatives. So the Senate in that way continues because only half the Senate faces an election at one time. So all of our senators are in fact elected. So we don't have any appointed senators. It has been raised though from time to time, especially in terms of having senators that represent special interest groups. So for example, we have Indigenous population in Australia, and it's often been raised that in order to raise the level of representation in the Parliament of the Indigenous peoples, that there should be a certain number of seats reserved for the Indigenous peoples. Now, in order to effect such a change, it would require an amendment to our Constitution, which sadly to say is notoriously difficult to amend. But still it remains an issue that is part of debate. But at the moment we do not have any appointed senators, we only have elected ones.
The Westminster, they have the hereditary peers, they are appointed. In the Canadian experience, they have all appointed, so are the judges. If you are to have your view and advice for Malaysia, your preference would be an appointed or elected senator?
Well, that's a tough question, Speaker. Well, you know, when I give advice about things, I usually relate it to my own experience, and I don't have any experience with such circumstance, so I really couldn't say. I know enough about parliaments and their composition to know, though, that it's very important that they reflect the individual society and that they need to reflect the culture and the values of the people. And so if there's a belief that a certain composition is what is suitable, then that is the one that would usually be the recommended one. So thank you for the question.
Hello, hi. My name is Tarma, and I'm representing Undi 18, which is a lobby group that's trying to lower the voting age in Malaysia. So my question is regarding the Australian experience, because I think there's some interesting stuff that we can learn from. So in Australia, the voting age is 18 years old, but also very interestingly, the age of becoming a member of both houses are also 18 years old. So for me, I definitely support that. I think every single adult Australian or Malaysian should have the right to compete and represent and serve their country. So I was curious, especially from an Australian perspective, could you maybe explain or maybe tell us a little bit about what were the justifications for that decision or for that decision to put it at 18 years old, both for the voting age and also for the age of being a senator, and should that be implemented in Malaysia? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Yes, voting age is a very contested topic at times. There are people in Australia at the moment thinking that, well, perhaps 18 is too old, it should be 16. 18 is regarded in Australia as the age of of being an adult. Number of years ago, when Australia was engaged in military service in Vietnam, we had the situation where young men were conscripted into the armed services at the age of 18, going off to fight a war, and they weren't old enough to vote. And so the argument was put that, well, if they're old enough to go and fight the war, which is certainly a mark of adulthood, then certainly they should be able to vote. So in the early 70s, the Prime Minister changed the laws and indeed reduced the age to vote from 21 to 18. I mean, enfranchisement is something that's changed over the years. I mean, once upon a time, women didn't have the right to vote, but of course they do now, and it's equality of voting in that sense. But again, you see these changes take place over time, and they involve active consideration by the competing interests in society about what would be preferable. The issue about us voting in Australia is that people are often critical of the Australian system too, because not only do we have voting from the age of 18, but it's actually compulsory voting. So there's not just an eligibility to vote once you reach the age of 18, but you're expected to vote. It's defined as compulsory voting. And sometimes people think, well, that isn't very democratic. If somebody is going to be an active participant in a democracy and to exercise their vote at an election, then surely it's their responsibility to go out there and inform themselves and know what they need to in order to be able to make an informed decision at the ballot box. But I have to say I hear those arguments, and I think that probably having compulsory voting isn't a bad idea, because it does then create the expectation that people should vote and will vote, and we get reasonably high levels of engagement by people in the political process, in the education about elections, what the policy platform is, and there is that expectation of people being active and informed members of society and exercising, which, let's face it, is a very special thing to be able to vote for the people who rule the country. And so I think,
Sorry, I
reasonable
was
thing.
also asking regarding the age of the senatorship, because in Malaysia, by constitution, you are only allowed to become a senator at 30 years old. So in my perspective, that should be lowered to 18 years old, the age of majority. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, obviously in our country, people who are the age of 18 can indeed stand for election. And we don't have any, we don't have a lot of criticism about that in our country. But it hasn't always been that way. It's something that's evolved over time. And so it's a matter of the community reaching the point of deciding that this is the way it should be. And so we've never had an 18-year-old elected, but we have had a 20-year-old elected to the House of Representatives, so very young. But if you accept that the electorate voted for this person, then surely the people who know them best are the ones that have the responsibility to vote for somebody to be their representative, and so you leave it in the hands of those voters to do that.
My name is Ahmad Jafar from Malacca. Speaker of Malacca. Now, I would like to ask this question. Do you think there would be any difference in terms of quality of a person taking up a public position, either in Senate or in Parliament, when one is elected by the process of election and the other one by the process of appointment. Now, my feeling is that when a person takes up a public position based on election, then the basis normally is on the question of popularity. But if a person is appointed, then there may be this criteria for appointment, maybe based on merit, integrity, and others. So, is there any difference between election and appointment? Thank you.
Well, thank you for the question. I mean, clearly on the superficial level, there's a difference. People are voted in or people are appointed. But obviously, when the appointments are made, they're done with a specific purpose in mind, and that is to ensure that a particular constituency is represented in the chamber. And so whether they're based, as in the case in Australia where it's been suggested that we have people to represent the Indigenous minority there, done to ensure that such a representation would be done to ensure that the views of that particular group can be heard, and that the arguments and the experiences of the individuals represented in that group can be taken into account when those very important decisions are being made about legislation or about programs. So if someone's appointed, then I would assume that that's the nature of the appointment, that they've been put there to represent the views of those constituencies. And so they're different, obviously, but you know, the decision is made about whether that's the approach that is relevant, either for that community or for that time. Political systems don't commence fully formed. They evolve over time. And so the views that are relevant at the commencement of a system may be quite different in 5 years' time or 10 years' time. And so the experience that is gathered along the way about how successful those appointments might have been to represent the views of those constituents that you're trying to ensure are heard, then there can be some assessments made about the success or otherwise of those appointments. But that's the sort of issues that could be considered, I think.
Hi. Hello. Can I? Please.
Okay, thank you. I'm Nge from Perak. I'm a member of Parliament and also the Speaker for the Perak State Assembly. Now, from the notes just now, your senators are voted in 166 years, while your House of Representatives, the term is only 3 years. Two questions I would like to pose. Now, in view of senators being elected, just like the House of Representatives, will the senators also very often act on we call partisan, we call stand, because they are also controlled, inverted commas, by their parties. So, from the Australian experience, will the senators also always toe the line of the party they represent? Number two, how are these votings carried out? Are they alternate? We call, you have election for your House of Representatives every 3 years, alternate, then on the 6th year, there will be election for the senators, or are they randomly decided by the government of the day? They can call off the Senate or the House of Representatives and hold an election. Like I see from the Australian experience, very often your government may not last the whole 3 years. The Prime Minister may call a snap election. And in view of the mandatory voting, will there be too many elections for the people to go out unless they are done simultaneously? Will the people complain and therefore may affect the turnout? I mean, mandatory, I do not know. What are the punishment if people don't vote? if I can have some idea or some picture of the situation there.
Yes, thank you. In relation to the elections, the senators are elected once every 6 years. So, for example, coming up this year, we have to have an election. The Senate will, half the senators will have their terms expire at the end of June, and the House of Representatives doesn't actually expire until the 2nd of November. But because the government likes to keep the expenditure on the election at the lower cost, it will have, we understand, this is based on public comments by the Prime Minister, that there will be a general election in May, and that all 150, well 51 now, because there's going to be an extra seat created, 151 members of the House of Representatives and half of the Senate, well approximately half the Senate, because it's half of the number of senators for the states and all of the territory members, so it's actually 40 of the 76, so a little bit over half, will face election in May. So only half of the senators. And so then in terms of the next election, all 150 members of the House of Representatives and the other half of the state senators and all the territory senators will face election. So for state senators, they only face election once every 6 years. The territory senators face election every time the House of Representatives faces election. So it's determined by when they were elected. So not by the government, it's determined by their own term. And I'm sorry, you asked me a question before that.
On the senators, will there be a whip of the party on
yes.
certain stand?
Yes.
Will
yes,
it be as partisan as House of Representatives?
Yes. So asking about party representation. Party representation and discipline in Australia is reasonably strong, but it doesn't mean that there can't be a general agreement about policies that are considered to be of benefit for the society. So they won't oppose every proposal, even if the parties are in opposition. They will take a policy stand and see if that's something that their party platform agrees with. But yes, they have whips, and the whips are the ones that will encourage them to vote in particular ways. Mind you, some of them don't always accept that, and they will vote how they wish. And that's something then the party needs to deal with if they're not happy with that.
As we are concerned with the reform of Parliament, I'm quite sure a lot of the honourable senators would have questions to ask how we can improve our role and functions as senators, especially in committee stages. May I invite the senators,
Dr. Paul. Well, my question is not to Ms. Clarissa, but I'd just like to seek from the speakers, state speakers, regarding my speakers from Johor, Swaziland, just now raise up the question about Senate at the state. Now, because your topic here is about parliamentary committees, and I am sure at state you have committees at the State Assembly too. Is there any legal or constitution issues for senators elected by the state to be appointed in the committee, in any of the select committee at the State Assembly, or maybe from the Attorney General Chambers can advise, or the speakers can advise us about that?
At the moment, most of the states, in fact, the not functioning at the state level. The State Assembly doesn't function very effectively as on a check and balance. Basically, most of the states, I use the word most of the states, except Selangor and others who have made changes, and Perak is hoping to make changes within this year. We have only 3 committees: the Public Accounts Committee, the Standing Order Committee, and the right and privileges of the, assemblymen, the three committees. So, like in Perak, we are now going to form extra committees. Committees on the management of the land office. The powers in Perak, in the states of Malaysia, the land matters, religious matter, the powers rest with the state, and also the local government, though it's in the joint list, but generally the state will appoint the local government. So we are forming a committee, select committee on local government, on land offices, and also the government-linked company, GLCs. These are the places where a lot of money is involved, a lot of things of value, land is involved. So we would like all these committees to function to check on the executive. At the moment, basically, the state assemblyman is, I use the word, more a social worker than a legislative assemblyman, because we meet hardly 12, 15 days a year. And the other time is more serving the public. So I would like to see the check and balance in this, by the formation of this committee to check on the land office approval of land. We'd like to see how the local government manage the funds they have, and also the GLCs that have billions of dollars in assets. So the way forward
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Just I raised this matter simply because when we talk about the reform agenda, I think not only at the parliamentary level, I think at the state level too, I think one of the reasons why we invited all the speakers from the state to be together with us here, so that whatever reform agenda that we are doing at the national level will be in line at the state level too. So I like the idea, Ms. Clarissa, you have the 8 committees, you know. In fact, here in the last parliament session, at the parliament level, now we are having how many, Heidi? 6. Huh? 7? Yeah. So I think it's time for at the state assembly level, so that the check and balance is being executed also. So why not the committees, you know, the select committee at the state level, and if there is no legal objection, why not the senators elected from the state being involved also in the committee? That is what my suggestion in this roundtable discussion today. Thank you.
Yeah, if I can do a quick response. In view of the limited scope of powers of the state, I do not think that we can have too many committees involving jurisdiction can come under the federal government. Another thing to note about the state, especially those with Malay rulers. In fact, we have a Senate, but this Senate is not part of our civil democratic system of Senate. I only realized this when I formed government, was in government 11 years ago. In fact, we have a parallel government to the civil government, the remnant from the earlier sultanate system. We have a Senate of the Orang Besar Jajahan. So, how do I put it? So we have basically the royal, the Sri Paduka Sultan very often will have an influence or check on balance on what is in the state. And traditionally, at least in Perak, every ESCO agenda or things to be approved will be forwarded, or he will be briefed on what is happening. So to have any form of we call reform, we may have to get we call consent or berkenan from the Tuanku, I believe so. So it may be not so simple that we can just decide on our own.
Yeah, my idea is,
I think for the benefit of those of all present, the Constitution is very clear, manifestly clear. Only at the national level you have bicameral, House of Commons in England, House of Lords. Here, Dewan Rakyat, Dewan Negara. at the state level is all unicameral. Only the state legislature. No state legislature in Malaysia has an upper house. In Australia, there are some states called state parliaments. They are bicameral. I was intending to ask you what would be the benefit and advantages would be at the state level where it's bicameral. In Malaysia, all state legislatures are unicameral. Now, those senators elected in the House at the state level, they represent that state at the national level in the Senate. They have no locus standi to sit in the state legislature.
Well, if I may take a few minutes, what a wonderful illustration of the complexities of federation. You know, your own system is a federal system, as Australia is. We've had federation since 1901. Prior to that, we were a collection of individual British colonies. And so they had existed with their own forms of parliament for many, many years before federation, and they were, for the most part, bicameral. And so the protections that were agreed while the Constitution was being negotiated in the 1890s were that the matter of the state parliaments were a matter for them. They already had constitutions of their own. They had a separate formal relationship between their own polity and the UK, so their own governor in place to represent the Queen or the monarch. So they existed as separate political entities a long time before federation, and they insisted that they have these protections embodied in the federal constitution, and so that's how it remains. The Senate came into existence as a state's house, states' rights. So the 6 original states have a very protected place in the constitution because they're all guaranteed to have the same number of senators for each state. They have 12 each. So this can lead to some anomalies or inequities if some people see it that way, because of the guarantee in the Constitution that all the states are treated equally. So you have the most populous states of New South Wales and Victoria, where you have Sydney and Melbourne, the 2 biggest cities. They have 12 senators. And then you have the tiny little state of Tasmania, which has a population only a little bit bigger than the Australian Capital Territory. And the Tasmania has 12 senators. The Australian Capital Territory has 2. So you see there are quite big differences in terms of representation, but it was part of the original agreement which resulted in federation. So these relationships can be embedded in the Constitution, and you know, that's the way we go forward. We start with that, and if there's an agreement that the Constitution should be changed, then of course it could be, although very difficult in Australia.
If I may, Mr. Moderator, here.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, my question is, if you can share with us how much importance is being placed into the role of opposition leader in the House, the Australian experience. We have seen in Malaysia for the last 40, 50 years where an opposition leader is just a figurative head of the opposition blocs. For the last few years, some attempt has been made to give importance to this office of opposition leader, whereby in some states, standing order has been revised to make it the opposition leader is also the head of the public account committees, which is one of the most important committee in the houses. How is the Australian experience in giving importance to this office of opposition leader? In our case, particularly the state of Selangor, there's some peculiarity when you try to do this reform. the opposition leader is stated in the standing order is to be appointed. It's not to be appointed. When he became the opposition leader, he's also the chair of the Public Account Committee. Apparently, it became an irony when an opposition leader is being appointed, but he refused to take the office of Public Account Committee chair. So can you share with us how much importance you put in the office of this opposition leader?
Thank you for the question. Yes, the opposition leader is a very important position in the Australian Parliament. Because of the nature of the houses, the opposition leader is always in the House of Representatives. So you have the Prime Minister in the House of Representatives, and you have the leader of the opposition also in the House of Representatives. And that is because the presumption is in our system that you have a government with a majority on the floor of the House of Representatives, and you also have a formal opposition. Now, it's been the case that usually the opposition still has quite a large number of members, even though they're not in government. And so they have quite a large body of members. We don't have the experience of some parliaments where you have a large number of parties represented in the House at one time. We usually only have 4 parties represented in the House of Representatives, and so usually when it's the Conservative parties with the majority, there'll be a coalition government, as there is at the moment. So coalition of the Conservative Liberal Party and the Conservative Nationals Party, and in opposition there is the Labor Party. And then there's one member of the Greens Party, so you've got basically just the 4 parties represented. But the system is based on having a government and having then a party that is testing the government, which is putting the counter point of view in relation to some matters, and so therefore the opposition. Now, I might say that neither of those 2 positions is mentioned in the Constitution. It's simply a matter of the practice and how the arrangements work in the House of Representatives.
I've been instructed by the organizer that this is going to be the last question.
Can I ask?
And can I invite the senators? I think if we can confine ourselves to parliamentary democracy committees, I think Ms. Kurt Sutis has shared with us the experiences. I think this is very important, how for us to reform and improve our Senate. Can I invite some?
Can I?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, thank you. I just want to ask, the Senate in Australia is elected by a system of proportional representations. And in Malaysia, 26 of our senators are elected, which is representing the states, and 40 of us are appointed by the king. My question is how Australia ensure the gender balance, since like I'm the head of the women's committees in the Senate reform. So how do you ensure that those candidates for the senators are equally represented? And if there is any policies or gender balance within the Senate or joint committee, because talking about the committee, I went through the list and there's nothing mentioned about the gender or, like representations of about the gender balance. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question. No, you're absolutely right. There's nothing in our standing orders or any of the rules about ensuring there is representation from male and female members or senators. The parties themselves are the ones that deal with whether or not their members are male or female. So I know from the Labor Party's point of view, they have a quota system to ensure that sufficient numbers of women are elected into the party, into winnable seats for the House of Representatives, and they also have a similar approach in relation to senators. That's not the case with the governing party, either the Nationals or the Coalition. There's been a lot of debate recently in Australia about the level of female representation in the Parliament. So it is an issue that is actively considered, but there are no formal rules in relation to it, either in terms of the standing orders or in legislation.
I think the two speakers, question.
Concerning this setting up of committees at the state level, I think just like what the federal parliament is doing, at the state level also we do create a number of committees. For example, in Malacca, recently we set up a committee called just like Selangor, Malkat. Malkat means Malacca, competency, accountability, and transparency, which I think is good to monitor and check and balance. So we are going to set up more committees because we feel that committees can improve the running of the one. Now, another thing which is a little bit out of parliamentary committee that we are talking today, I just want to ask your opinion, the change in terms of using some of the terminologies that has been used all along now. For example, I go through the Constitution and also the standing order. The word opposition is not mentioned, if I'm not. Now, because of that, in Malacca, I don't use the word opposition. And instead, I use the word non-government. So when I ask now, okay, government, give the answer. Non-government, take comment now. No. You know why I do that? Because I feel that when you use the word opposition, it gives quite a negative connotation, implication that, now why should I support the government? Because you call me opposition. But when you call them non-government, thank you, because when you do bad, we take over the government. Because we are now non-government. So now I want to ask whether it is proper now to adopt the use of non-government rather than opposition. Thank you.
I mean, you raise a very interesting point, and of course language is important in terms of shaping the relationships in the House. I guess the significant difference is that you can have non-government members which are nevertheless have particular sympathies towards the government. So it doesn't have quite the same meaning as opposition. But I understand exactly your point about if you call somebody opposition, then they think they have to oppose the government all the time. I understand that. And so if you're trying to encourage a greater level of collaboration or partisanship, then perhaps if you change the language, you might influence that relationship. But that's possible. But yes, you're right. I mean, you say your constitution doesn't talk about opposition. Well, and ours doesn't either. So it doesn't mention the Prime Minister. It doesn't mean the Prime Minister isn't real and exists. It's just that it's not embedded in the Constitution. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Once again, on behalf of everyone here, I'd like to thank Ms. Carissa Suti for her presentation. And also like to thank her for taking the travel all the way from Australia to come to be with us today. And I'm quite sure we will take away whatever she presented to us today to adopt and try and utilize to improve our own Senate. Thank you once again, Suti. And I'd like to thank everyone as well for taking part in this question and answer session. Unfortunately, because of time constraint, I've been told by the organizer that we have to stop here. I think everybody's hungry, it's lunchtime. Thank you once again, and we'll go on, I think, after lunch. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Honorable Senator Datuk Theodore Douglas Lin and Ms. Clarissa Surtees for the presentation. Ladies and gentlemen,